Bienvenidos to the Carne Asada, ladies and gentlemen, the Bleed Lows podcast with our special guest today, the director of the new documentary After Jackie, Andre Gaines. Before we get to it with Andre, I just want to take care of some business here. This episode of the Bleed Lows podcast is brought to you by BetOnline. Our partners at BetOnline continue to be the number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. So you can find all the latest odds, news, and sports developments, including this year's Wimbledon finals, Major League Baseball, and the latest fighting news, and even next season's early NFL futures. So head to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today and receive 50% a welcome bonus on your first deposit. So just use the promo code. It's Believe, BLEAV, to get the bonus and get into the action. Bet online, it's where the game starts. And so, as I mentioned, we have Andre here, but before we get to it, we want to show you guys the trailer for his new film, After Jackie.
Jackie Robinson established a model for the next generation.
He gave the Bill Whites and the Bob Gibsons and the Kurt Floods the path to say this is unacceptable.
Baseball has not moved with the time. When you can be sold like in 1890.
Players had no power.
Jackie's legacy is more than just baseball. What he did for others, that's his legacy.
After Jackie, June 18th at 8. Next day on the History Channel app.
Bravo. Welcome, Andre. Thank you for taking a moment to hang out with us. I'm assuming it is pretty crazy for you. This just released After Jackie, and to all of you joining us on the Bleed Lows podcast, After Jackie is available on the History Channel, and that's where I watched it. I've made my mom and dad watch it. My daughter will be watching it, because just when we thought we knew everything about Jackie, and being a baseball lover myself, a third generation baseball lover, now you go and make After Jackie. And I'm just like, it is very, very, it's just awesome. So I want to get right into it. And if for someone who doesn't love baseball like we do, or who doesn't know about Jackie, or thought, I've seen the 42 movies and stuff, why should we go and see After Jackie?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it. Great to talk to you guys. I mean, I think that answer is kind of, twofold. First is, Ken Griffey Jr., who was in our film, he's in the trailer that you just showed, really has one of my favorite lines in the whole film, which is that Jackie's legacy is what he did for others. I mean, Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier, frankly, was probably the least important thing that he did, and it's the only thing that we ever hear, is all of the stuff that he did afterwards that he just doesn't get much credit for. We never see that version of the gray-haired man going out marching in front of thousands of people and giving speeches in front of thousands of people and working with Dr. King and becoming this amazing civil rights leader that he became alongside Dr. King, Harry Belafonte, and so many others. And so that's really, the first thing. It's sort of a double meaning, the title After Jackie. It's after Jackie, the guys that came after Jackie, but then it's also after Jackie, after the Jackie Robinson that we thought we knew, or that we knew, or that we think that we know. And there's a version of him in retirement that we just never get a chance to see. So that's really the first reason. The second reason is that when LeBron James and his team over at Spring Hill approached me about making this movie, I was honest with them that while I'm a baseball fan, I'm not a baseball aficionado. And that if you guys dare ask me who won the World Series in 1972, I have no clue who that is. And so there's like, well, no, you're perfect. You're exactly what we're looking for, because to answer your question, I wanted to make a film that was for the baseball fans and for just the lovers of history and the lovers of great storytelling at the end of the day, for folks who are not going to be immersed and all of the fine details, which I know a lot more than I ever did at the beginning of the game of baseball, and understand how it plays. And so we wanted to have those highlights in there for the baseball fans and really get a chance to see some of that great footage from the 64 World Series and the Cardinals team and all that sort of stuff. But we also wanted to have a great story of great characters, and we were able to achieve both.
Yes, you did. And one of my favorite scenes was when you brought the old time video of Bob Gibson just
Oh, man.
pegging.
Oh, he's great.
I was like, what? Like, yeah, super cool. I was digging that. But you mentioned Ken Griffey Jr. And so how did it come about that you were able, to work with Mookie Betts, CC Sabathia, like the stars that we
Right.
saw throughout your film? Did you personally reach out to them? Was this a collab with LeBron or
Oh, sure. Well, it's helpful to have LeBron James as an executive
Right.
producer. That's all. That's all I'll say. It's little known guy. No, that really came through LeBron and his team and their relationship. I mean, Spring Hill Uninterrupted, they're a very athlete focused and sports driven company. Their motto is more than an athlete. So they really try to tell these stories beyond the field, beyond the court, beyond the game. And so when it came to Mookie Betts, who was awesome to not only meet in person, but to, really get a chance to chat with off camera. CC was fantastic. I, did his show R2C2, and have seen him multiple times. He was just great. And then the great, Ken Griffey Jr., who said that I was, the only one able to pull him out of his house to be willing to sit down and have a conversation, because he's like, I'm a dad, I'm a homebody, I'm just down here having a great time with my kids and chilling and this sort of thing. But I couldn't miss the opportunity to talk about Jackie Robinson, and then also talk about the heroes of the game in Bill White, Bob Gibson, and Curt Flood, that were heroes to him, just like his own father was a hero to him, that a lot of people just have never heard of and just don't know about. I mean, that Bob Gibson sequence, I was like, this has to go in here, just because they lowered the mound because of this guy, of how domineering and dominant he was in these games. They had to lower the mound for just, out of sheer terror when Bob Gibson came up to the mound. It's like, yeah, we got to show some of these moments where he's beaming folks, because it's pretty extraordinary. And so I was insistent that we have that in there.
Well, thank you for that. I know Juan was also a fan of those Bob Gibson scenes, right, Juan?
Well, yeah, and I want to know how the sausage is made here, Andre. So I know that LeBron and his company approached you, but
Right.
when it comes to documentary, a lot of people may not know this. There is writing involved. It's just a little different, right? It's not a prepared script. So the pitch for the story, did you come up with that pitch in terms of, we want to focus on Curt Flood, we want to focus on Bob Gibson? Because there was probably a handful of other players that you guys could have, followed after Jackie Robinson. Who came up with the pitch in the arc of the story?
So yeah, last year I made a film called The One and Only Dick Gregory. It was about the late great comedian, is on Showtime, and it was around that time that LeBron and his team had approached me about this project. And so LeBron James and Stanley Nelson, the great filmmaker, they had been working on this prior to my arrival. And so that's really where that main pitch came from. And it had a lot to do with, and the reason why there was a focus, and it's a good question, because it was something that I had talked about as well, and realized that just given the runway that we had, which was 2 hours, we're not going to be able to go into Willie Mays or Hank Aaron or Ernie Banks or so many of these other great guys that followed Jackie Robinson. The focus was heavy on the Cardinals team, on that early 60s Cardinals team, and what it is that they brought to the game and the style of play that they had, which was very similar to the Negro Leagues when it came to speed, when it came to aggressiveness and the base pass and all those types of things. And so we really wanted to try to sort of consolidate the understanding of what was happening at that period of time. And it just also happened that those three major figures in the game, and both on and off the field, happened to play on that one team. And so that's sort of where the ethos kind of built itself, or developed itself into becoming at the end of the day. But, we had Mike Claiborne, who's one of the broadcasters from the St. Louis Cardinals, who really talks about Bill White, for instance, as being one of probably the second most important person in black man in the game of baseball, next to Jackie Robinson, in his opinion, for his breaking the barrier in the front office as, first and only black president of a national league, and then also as a broadcaster. And then the same for, Curt Flood. Folks who don't know anything about baseball, but are, again, students of history, know a little bit about Curt Flood and his path to what we know as modern day free agency. So there was a lot of contributions that these three guys made. We already talked about Bob Gibson, that really helped shape the story to understand. But, there's nothing wrong with trying to fight for part 2 or part 3 of this thing, because there's so many more stories, to tell. And we were grateful to get Hank Aaron in there, an interview that was conducted with him before he passed away, to really be able to kind of speak to the subject in such an elegant and eloquent way.
And and Alicia mentioned it, and that is, there's so many directions that you could have gone into, right? And you're right, and it's like you could do a part 2, you could do a part 3. Here on the Bleed Lows podcast, we are the only Latino podcast in LA that focuses on the Dodgers and Dodger-centric. To me, one of the natural questions, and this is not to take a shot at your film, was where are the Afro-Latinos, right? But that's a different story that you can tell in a different film. But what it got me into thinking was the representation. The fact that you as an African American are telling this story, to me, is very important, because point of view matters. And the fact that, look, I am a huge fan of Michael Mann, and I think the movie Ali is a great movie. I think it's underappreciated. But I know Spike Lee had some problems with, it's like, why is a white man telling this story? In terms of, did you feel a responsibility that the story of Curt Flood, the story of Bob Gibson, is a story that you had to get right?
Oh, for sure. I mean, that really started for me with Dick Gregory. I mean, the movie came out last year, but we had been working on it for, 4 or 5, 6 years, actually, from the first time that we filmed him. And what happened in that period of time for me personally was sort of a crafting or development of a personal mission as a filmmaker, which is to put these historic figures, these historic moments, these historic events, and the ones particularly that are lesser known, in their right place in history, almost like a museum curator finding a precious artifact and putting it in a museum on display for people to see and learn something different than they did before they walked in the door. And so when it came to Bill White, when it came to Bob Gibson and Curt Flood, I think that there was already a natural attraction for me to this story because of those guys. And because I didn't know, Curt Flood I knew a lot about because of another potential project we're working on around him. But with Bill White and with Bob Gibson, these are names that I had known just from being a student of history, but not really the audience knowing them that way. And so it was like, okay, well, listen, not only were we talking about some major contributions here that we can educate people on, but, let's sort of hide the broccoli and the brownie, as they say, we got to put this in an entertaining package. And just by virtue of it, you end up learning something. And so we got an opportunity to do that on the History Channel, because it's built for that. It's specifically built for that. And so that's what was cool about it. So yes, I did feel the obligation to make sure I got it right. And listen, every filmmaker will tell you that every movie breaks your heart, like a little bit, just because of the stuff that you have to leave. You mentioned the Afro-Latino players, who are dominant today, or prominent today, I should say, that especially during that period of time, when Jackie was going down to the Caribbean in order for spring training and that sort of stuff. I mean, there's just just so much more. I mean, there's definitely a series of some kind that's kind of inherent in what it is we're telling, but just not enough time in a single film. So that's why it breaks your heart all the time.
Yeah.
So much stuff you got to leave alone.
It's I think George Lucas is the one who said that movies aren't finished; they're abandoned.
They are. Yeah, that's exactly right.
It's like sooner or later we got an air date. We got to have it done.
Yeah, there's nothing you can mess with it, and you can work on it just for forever. And sometimes you get very precious with it, and it's like you just don't ever want it to leave. But eventually that kid grows up and becomes the 25-year-old living in the basement that needs to go get a job. You got to get out of here, and that's sort of what happens with some of these things. But there's always opportunity, especially when we go back in history and pull it up to the present to tell more stories.
Beautiful. Go ahead, Alicia.
I just want to make sure, I want to follow up with that. So Juan and I were talking about this film earlier today. Again, we are with director and producer Andre Gaines. If you're just joining us on the Bleed Lows podcast, he just released with LeBron James and company a film about after Jackie. So it's the second wave of ball players, correct? After Jackie Robinson. So again, he is more than just breaking the color barrier. You were discussing, what was it? Putting the broccoli in the brownies. I love that. And I did hear, different references when you mentioned Ted Williams going off to war. I got really excited. And it was a brief mention, and it was not even relevant to what the theme of this film is. But you also mentioned how Black professional ball players, as well as darker Hispanic ball players, were treated differently, in and outside of the stadium, the buses, all of that. Right. But I wanted to also mention, if there are any projects in the works, Ted Williams is Mexican, and he had to hide that from the Boston, Red Sox and that notorious fan base. And I won't get into that, but any word, any juicy gossip you could give us as sports lovers?
Oh, well, that's you're starting the juicy gossip.
I want a Ted Williams film. You're hearing it here.
I know. You know how many people. So it's Ted Williams, and there's another player who was on the Negro Leagues, whose name eludes me now, but it's huge guy. I mean, he was like a bear. He was this massive guy. It was that, and then that player, Ted Williams, and there was one other one. And so people, that's what's kind of cool about making these movies, is that there's people who are like just learning it and just getting to know it. And then there's like the total nerds who know everything about it. And so then there's the ones that are just like, yeah, you got to tell this story. This is awesome, which I love because I'm a nerd. And then there's also the nerds, which I call, the actuallys online, and say, well, actually, that didn't actually, happen to Jackie. And well, actually, it's like, okay, we get it. We're trying to make a movie here, for Christ's sake. We're writing a book that's 300 pages. But yeah, so no, there's not anything in the works, but I've written it down because I do think that the cool thing about baseball is that if you look at the history of baseball, it is directly parallel with the history of the United States. So there is a whole, you can essentially tell the story of the history of the United States through baseball and really sort of understand the bits and pieces of where the country was at the time, where it is, how it sort of moved, the progress of it. Because a lot of people, for instance, didn't know that there were black ball players before Jackie Robinson, which is something that we put in the film.
Yeah.
We talk about Bud Fowler, we talk about Moses Fleetwood Walker, and these guys who were playing in that version of the major leagues in the late 1800s, which was at a time in our nation's history post Reconstruction, after the Emancipation Proclamation, where we saw the one of the greatest decades of black wealth and thriving black communities, the building of cities all over the country and things like that. And so they were black Americans were part of every facet of American society, including Congress at the time, before being booted out or having these gentlemen's agreements in place to ban them from that type of participation. And so that would consume the country really for 60 years until Jackie Robinson shows up in 1947 to try to reverse that, right, where we start to see the civil rights movement happen. So that's what's cool, and I think it's a great idea. And if I have any say so, we'll try to see if we can make that happen.
I just want to follow up with what you just mentioned again. So if baseball truly does, which I agree with you, follow along the history of the United States, you know, Chris Rock not too long ago mentioned that there weren't enough young black ball players. Would you say that it's gotten better or worse in MLB? And I'm not trying.
Yeah, right. No, it's a worthy question. Yeah, it's a worthy question because it's one that came up a lot, especially with Mookie and CC and Ken Griffey Jr. You know, it came up quite a bit, and really sort of talking about. We talked with Tony Regans, you know, who's over these special programs that MLB is doing, and it's really the answer is yes. There's not enough Black Americans in the sport. Obviously, not dismissing our Afro-Latino brothers that are in the sport, which have to deal with the same level of discrimination. But because we're talking about it being an American story and how much this has impacted how much of an impact Jackie Robinson breaking that color barrier had on the Black community and Black participation, especially something we barely highlighted in the film, which is understanding how much Black folks loved baseball and how big of a deal it was, and how much the Negro Leagues were a cornerstone financially, big business in these segregated Black communities at the time. I do think that there is a lot of work that needs to be done. You know, we sort of track that in our film of the time after Jackie Robinson, decades after him, that gets better and better, probably sort of peaking with Ken Griffey Jr. Before we start to see those numbers start to decline. And right now, that's somewhat equivalent to the percentage of when Jackie Robinson retired in 1957. So we don't want to go backwards, you know, nobody does. You know, Black folks, Latino folks, white folks, you know, just everybody working hard to try to create what Obama referred to as more perfect union. That's in sports too. It's one of the few places in America that the tribalization of sports. Yeah. It's one of the few places where we can actually see change in the country, because it's one of the few places everybody actually comes together. I mean, on the field is Democrats, Republicans, you got, you know, tall, skinny, you know, whatever it is, like black, white, yellow, brown, it doesn't matter. Is that if we all are coming together and want to see our Dodgers, or we want to see our Lakers, or we want to see, you know, our Rams, or you know, whoever, it's like we're all coming together there. And it's one of those few places. Like, name someplace else like that other than sport in America. Maybe not church. You know, not church.
True that.
Yeah, not any place that, you know, you have first class, second class, third class. You sort of divide it. It's like when everybody can put on a jersey and go root for their team. So it would be great to see that, and they are working hard. MLB is working hard to try to change that fact and make it more accessible to black and brown kids, just because it's gotten quite expensive, so sort of beyond the little leagues at this point. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Juan, can I ask them, or
Go ahead.
I'm being selfish here, but since you brought up our LA teams, I know you were born in Ohio, you went to Northwestern, and I think you worked in New York. So who are your teams, your baseball team? Give me your baseball team and your favorite baseball players growing up.
Well, it's funny because I grew up in Ohio, grew up in Toledo, Ohio. We didn't have a major league team. We had a minor league team, the Mud Hens,
Nice.
Toledo Mud Hens. We would often, because it was only like 45 minutes from Detroit, so we would often gravitate to the kind of like Detroit teams or like the Cleveland teams. Mm-hmm. But because of that, it sort of, left us in kind of like a ubiquitous space where you just sort of like love whoever it is that's cool. It was like, okay, this King Griffey Jr., sure. This is, right. Of course, who doesn't love this guy? So that would probably be my favorite baseball player growing up. And I told him that. And we had to do a virtual interview because of the travel schedule. And he was like, you love me so much you couldn't even fly down here to come see me. I said, no, I do adore you. So I'm glad you're on. But yeah, and so we had, the growing up, like other teams, Pistons were like a big deal from a basketball standpoint. The Indians from a baseball standpoint. We were able to branch out and kind of widen our net by not having those major league teams in our home city. And so that sort of expands all the way out to the East Coast, primarily growing up. And then when I moved to LA, I became a fan of all the LA teams. Like anybody can avoid this, it's like we've got all these teams here. There's no way that you can avoid being a Lakers fan or a Dodgers fan or any of the above.
Good answer.
Exactly.
I know. I ended it where you wanted me to. So.
Hey, Andre, I wanted to ask you, in terms of, there's a lot of broccoli, as you mentioned in this movie. Right. And to the point where I was kind of embarrassed that I didn't know this stuff. And that's why I think you do have to look at this as this is not another Jackie Robinson movie, because it's looking at that story, but through a different lens, so to speak. One of the things that I found really interesting was how you modernized the story, using footage from current day events and realizing that history really does tend to repeat itself. Right. And I don't know how much of it has hit home to people who, maybe for people in the 60s who grew up during that civil rights era. That's right. They might be looking at this era going, this is happening again, while other people I think maybe dismiss and be like, no, it's nothing like the 60s. Was that intentional for you to draw the comparison between what's happening now to what those guys were going through in the 60s?
Oh, sure. I did it in my last film, and the New York Times loved it. Mm-hmm. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this again. Because I'm going to do this again. Yeah, it was funny because it was really trying to, it helped. It was surprising. Sometimes you think of these things as a storyteller as being kind of obvious to people. Yeah. But until you put it in a visual medium, it's surprising that it's not so obvious to people, because with television and film, which are two of the most powerful propaganda tools ever invented on planet Earth, unless it's like right there in your face, most people aren't spending time in a library, flipping through microfiche or whatever the fuck version, excuse me, my French, but whatever the version of that is now, right? Yeah. And so it's kind of like that's our job as storytellers, as filmmakers, is to sort of put that there. And so, yeah, it was very intentional because there were just so many parallels. Just so many parallels. I mean, what was the story just recently, even of somebody using Jackie Robinson's name as a racial slur?
Oh, yes, that was Donaldson of the Yankees.
Donaldson, right?
Saying it to Tim Anderson, calling him Jackie.
Which it's sort of like we're still dealing with that. We're still dealing with that level of brazen bigotry or brazen racism, being very proud of it in a way. So it's very strange, But strange to us, right? Strange to you and me, because we weren't part of that. But if you talk, to my grandparents and that sort of thing, and the other thing too, they were able to understand it and connect those dots. But the other part of it too is the thing that my grandparents would say, and I remember Dick Gregory would always say this, is that to ever say that we haven't made progress would be, and substantial progress would be, to diminish the legacies of the people who sacrificed literally their lives, their blood, sweat, tears, their finances, their families, their friends, in order to make our freedoms and liberties possible. And so I never say that because of that, but the other piece, because it is true that we have made a lot of progress, but we get to see those sort of moments in time where people are being racist, or people are being sexist, or people are being discriminatory, and really think, have we made enough progress to try to change their hearts and minds? And we can just keep trying. That's really it. We can just keep trying at the end of the day. And this film is a little piece of that trying.
Absolutely. And the thing is I really did enjoy your film because not only the baseball aspect of it, the history aspect of it, but I do have to admit, though, Andre, it bummed me out. And this is what bummed me out was you're highlighting figures like Curt Flood, and we see what Jackie Robinson was doing after he retired, right? Putting his life on the line. And it just made me think, I don't know if there's anyone in Major League Baseball right now that would have the courage that those players had, because you saw what Colin Kaepernick did. No one in Major League Baseball came close to making any type of political statement. And I say this, I know this. I know that baseball is a very conservative sport. So I don't expect any of the athletes in that sport to take those stands. But to hear Bob Gibson not show up to Curt Flood's hearing, but Jackie Robinson did. And I don't blame Bob Gibson, right? Because he has to feed his family, right? But to hear him say that, it just made me realize, man, how we need people like Jackie Robinson.
Yeah, they come along once in a lifetime. I mean, it's kind of like we need an MLK or Martin Luther King. It's like, well, no, you don't need a Martin Luther King. You need Martin Luther King. Right. It's like, that's it. That was the guy. And that's why when the country lost him, haven't seen another version since. And that's the legacy of Jackie Robinson, is that if we don't have this one singular hero figure that we can make huge statues out of, can we take his legacy and spread it out so that we can have this guy over here working to advance the front office, and have this guy over here working to advance broadcast, and have this guy over here working to advance general manager, and have this one over here working to advance pitcher, and sort of all of the positions that are historically missing minority groups and smaller disenfranchised groups. And that's the real takeaway, is yes, we can do that. That there's only, in the course of a lifetime, maybe twice if you're lucky, that somebody of that magnitude comes along and is able to create that level of change on a worldwide scale. And we get to see that we get to see examples of that legacy in Bill White, in Bob Gibson, in Curt Flood, in the film. Like no one of them alone measured up to a Jackie Robinson, but each of them were a part of him, and each of them were people who could advance his legacy in ways that he couldn't even advance his legacy. And sadly, the bummed out part that you feel, that I felt when making it, is that a lot of that discrimination was worse for that second wave of guys, because they didn't have the cameras on them. They didn't have the world watching. They didn't have every reporter on earth there, taking down notes for every breath and move that Jackie Robinson made. So they had to deal with that and had to face that without the support of the public in a way that Jackie Robinson had, even if that public was only maybe 50% of the public, or 30% of the public. At the end of the day, he had that support. So yeah, it's heartbreaking in some regards. It's heartbreaking to be able to hear that. I mean, for me, you mentioned Bob Gibson not showing up to Curt Flood's court hearing, but also hearing Bob Gibson talk about crying because he couldn't stay with his teammates.
Yeah.
I mean, this domineering figure that frightened the hell out of everybody is somewhere falling apart because he's being discriminated against in a way that he's never experienced, and being castigated and marginalized. And so we get to be able to see that, but also understand how these guys came together to make a change and make differences in the world.
Absolutely. We have a few more minutes with the director of the new documentary After Jackie, Andre Gaines. Alicia, do you have any last questions for Andre?
Before we get to the rapid fire, I just want to say, Andre, you mentioned we were lucky to have a Jackie Robinson, to have an MLK. I think we're also lucky and grateful for our storytellers like yourself and my co-host.
Oh, thank you.
It's so important. The power of storytelling, the power of media, we take it for granted in this country. Mm-hmm. And there are times that I fear we're going to lose it. So we need to keep making these documentaries, these stories. And one, my co-host mentioned earlier, point of view matters. Representation matters. It's something very dear and important to me. So when I see films like this, yes, the story itself was a bummer, one, but it was also a kind of like, yay, this I learned something new and it's out there. Right. Because you said it yourself, we're not going to libraries, right? And how would I know to Google, after Jackie, the second wave, unless you have
unless you have a path. Unless you have a little bit of a path. And that's what the goal was of the film, was to open up a little path for people to explore more. We want people going online and Googling things and going on Wikipedia and looking up stuff. That's the goal after you make a movie like this. I mean, I know that was the case with the one and only Dick Gregory. It was the case with After Jackie as well. And I just get a flood of social media messages and inquiries and all types of stuff of people not only saying thank you for telling me a story that I haven't heard and teaching me something I didn't know, but then also people who were like, oh, my grandfather was in the Negro Leagues, or my father played Major League Baseball for Mariners, or whoever it is, and be able to tell the stories of what they kind of went through as well. But it may be a little uncomfortable, but it's like we have to tell it. We have to bring it up to the forefront at some point.
Let's keep this going, people. All you filmmakers out there, writers. Yeah. I want more.
Exactly. There's so much more. And it probably starts with Ted Williams, so we'll get started there.
Andre, we're gonna wrap up the show the way we always wrap up the show on the Bleed Lows podcast. But I want to do a couple rapid fire questions for you before we wrap it up.
Sure.
First of all, when we talked about like point of view, what Alicia just said, mentioning one of the subjects in your film is someone I want to learn more about, and that's Wendell Smith. And the role that columnists play in this country, because they have narratives that they can push in certain ways. How much did you know about Wendell Smith going into this project?
So, in fairness, I actually knew a little more about Wendell Smith than I knew about the other players, because one of my good friends, Andre Holland, played him in 42. And so we went to school together at NYU. And again, it was one of those things after seeing a story or seeing a figure in history that you didn't know much about, and then you sort of go and learn a little bit more about. And Brad Snyder, who was in our film, the historian who wrote a book about Curt Flood, really, I think, does a great job of highlighting how much these reporters, Wendell Smith was really sort of at the forefront, but there were others, were truly on a crusade. They weren't just writers. They were recruiters. They were coaches. They were sort of a multitude of things on a crusade to get black players in the game of baseball, and working directly with owners and managers to try to scout these players and bring the managers to see them play, and vice versa. And the one person who heeded that, advice, was on the Dodgers, for Jackie Robinson. And that's how we end up, getting the story of Jackie Robinson at the end of the day. So it was really cool, to hear more even about Wendell Smith than I knew, but then also be able to try to bring that to an audience and try to help them understand it too.
Okay, two questions here. I see you're wearing a Michaud shirt, and I don't know who else is on here. So okay. So I need to ask you, who is the most influential director for you? And who's your favorite director? Because I think it could be two different answers there.
Oh man, that's a good question. Probably the most influential director, I would say, is Orson Welles.
Oh, okay.
To me personally, or you mean overall?
Yeah. For you, what? Okay. In terms of influential, what I mean, what director's work has informed your work the most, and then your favorite? Because I think there could be two.
Basically, everybody who's here. So that's Oscar Michaud, Gordon Parks, Spike Lee, John Singleton, and Antoine Fuqua.
Okay.
A lot of people again don't know about Oscar Michaud. Right. Who was really the first major black director in Hollywood, and was out there making his movies, and producing his own movies, and had his own studio, and was doing all of these things kind of outside of a system that wasn't allowing him to be in it. I think HBO is doing a show about him, of which Tyler Perry is starring as Oscar Michaud. There's scenes in Tyler Perry's movies that come directly from some Oscar Michaud films, as filmmakers all borrow from each other. So yeah,
it's homage. We call it homage, right? That's
homage. Yeah, right. Nothing is new. Yeah. So yeah, I would say those filmmakers would probably be the most influential, for sure. And then Orson Welles, just I think from a holistic standpoint of a storyteller, of the things that he was able to do in Citizen Kane, which still to this day are the benchmark and cornerstone of modern filmmaking that everybody uses.
And your favorite movie?
So my favorite movie is probably a cop-out to a lot of people, but it's The Shawshank Redemption.
Really? Okay.
Cop-out? That's a great film.
Yeah, well, no, I'm saying a cop-out because I feel like people feel like it might be easy. You know, it might be too easy. I mean, I named some obscure film, like
right.
800 Blows or, something like that. But yeah, that movie is really fantastic. I would say the film that is the close second, if not equal, is Amadeus.
Really?
From 1984. Yeah. So
one of my top
Milos Forman film and the Shawshank Redemption, a Frank Darabont movie.
I totally thought you were going to pull the film student and tell me Killer of Sheep by Charles Burnett.
No. Killer of Sheep I love. I do love it for especially its cinematic qualities, and again, it being a cornerstone of modern drama. But yeah, just as far as like pitch perfect execution, without any error, and any reason that we shouldn't be in a scene or hear a story being told, those two films are just magnificent.
Sorry, I was being a douche there. I love Killer of Sheep, so it was just my way to work in Killer of Sheep. Because I know there's probably, all the listeners have no clue what I'm talking about.
They probably have no clue. No.
No clue.
They really don't. But it's a marvelous, marvelous film. And it was a film that, again, was one of the first films, because I went to film school at NYU. Mm-hmm. It's one of the first films that they showed us. And it was like, oh, yeah, I understand why you're showing this to us. So.
That's awesome. Well, on the Bleed Lows podcast, we are about LA. We are about, LA culture. We're about the Dodgers. So we're going to end it with what we are most known for, and that's taco culture. Being that now you're in LA and you're a Dodger fan, you're a Laker fan, we need to know, what is your favorite taco and where do you go in the city to get that taco?
Okay, so this would be a plug for a wonderful restaurant in Santa Monica, of all places, because my wife, who is the real foodie, has places on east side of LA.
Yeah,
that she has yet to take me, by the way. So it's like, you want to send her a note. She comes back, she starts talking about all these tacos and all this other stuff, and it's like, why don't you take me? Would be great. But the place that has one of the best atmospheres and great tacos is a place called Lares in Santa Monica.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Lares.
And so what kind of
little family owned?
What kind of meat is that? What's your favorite taco in there? What kind of meat do you need to have? He's got to think about it.
No, sorry, my kid came back from swim class. Okay, let's start over. Ask me that again. So
what is the meat? So when you go to Lares, what kind of, are you getting a carne asada taco, or are you getting
so their hard shell beef tacos are just amazing, and then their soft tortilla tacos. I love the shrimp taco.
Okay.
Which is kind of like a little spicy shrimp, and they have like the best margaritas ever. So so you're lucky I remember any of this stuff, because every time I walk out of there, I'm just like, yeah, I gotta not drink so much.
So are you
the name of that, right?
Yeah. Again. So are you a corn or a flour tortilla man?
I'm a flour tortilla man.
Okay, yeah. So now you're starting something, because to us on the show, we view the flour tortilla as the oppressor's tortilla. Okay, Andre? It is the oppressor's tortilla.
I'm the wrong.
The conquistadors came and introduced flour to the indigenous people, and I get it. It's good. I get it.
You set me up.
It's good. Yeah, no, yeah. I didn't mean, it's not a gotcha.
Yeah, but it's like, okay, so here's a funny story. So I'm a flour egg roll guy too.
Oh, okay.
So like East Coast, like New York Chinese food. is different than LA. So growing up, that's the Chinese food that I had, because even in Ohio was still the same thing, and it was sort of this kind of crispy shell egg roll, and out here it was like soy paper that they use, or rice paper that they fry, and we couldn't find it anywhere, and we found it like randomly in some place in Inglewood or something, and the woman, who's a Chinese woman, she was explaining what you just said, which was this was the version that we made in America, because when we came over, because we didn't have the traditional ingredients, so we ended up pivoting and making it that way. So that's why you see that type of Chinese food in New York, and you see this type of, because by the time it got to LA, it got authentic.
See,
is the idea. So
there we go. We have Andre just justified her. All our listeners who get mad because I bring up the oppressor's tortilla, it's a real thing. So there you have it. We want to thank our guest, Andre Gaines, the director of After Jackie. It's a documentary you can find on the History Channel. You can stream it for those of you through your cable company. As long as you have the History Channel, it's on demand. Check it out.
And History Channel app.
And the History Channel app. Andre, where can our listeners follow you, find you on the social media?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram at Andre L. Gaines. And that's where I'm mainly at. I mean, I have a Twitter account, Andre Gaines, and Facebook the same, but mainly spend all the time on Instagram. So that's where folks can find me.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. Go check out the movie, guys. And this episode of the Bleed Lows podcast was brought to you by Bet Online. It's where the game starts. Thank you very much. See you until next time.